Hello there. We are going to be taking a look at the basics of Photoshop. For the first lesson, we are going to be looking at how things work and what does what. And so we're going to start with the toolbar, move on over to the menus, and then take a look at these panels over here and just get a basic overview of what your tools are. And there are a lot of them. Obviously, we can't cover everything, and so we're just going to try to get you some fundamentals so you can get started with Photoshop, learn to explore, and then move forward with some further resources we'll include at the end of the week. Now, some of you might be saying, why are we learning Photoshop? Photoshop's expensive, I don't want to pay for it, and there are other alternatives out there that I can use instead. You're right. There are plenty of other alternatives you can use. Even Photoshop Elements is a cheaper option. There are things on the Mac like Pixelmator, and then there's also GIMP, which is free and open source. So if you'd like to use any of those tools, that's perfectly fine. What we'll be covering here is mostly applicable to a lot of different photo and design softwares. So we'll be looking at some Photoshop specific tools, but we will be covering a lot of basic stuff that you can use in anything. So whatever your graphic editor of choice is, you will be covered. Now, today is probably going to be a little bit more Photoshop specific than the other days because we're going to be looking at specific tools in Photoshop. And we're going to start with the toolbar first. So if you go over here, this is your toolbar. And we're going to be looking at Photoshop CS5, by the way, since that's the most current version at the moment. Now you can see I'm hovering over the Move tool, and it has a V next to it. So if I hit V on my keyboard, it will select the Move tool. And if you want to find out the keyboard shortcuts to any other thing on the toolbar, or you want to know what they are, then you just hover over them. Now we're going to take a really quick look at everything, so you're going to want to explore this stuff yourself. Now the Move tool is not going to do a whole lot because the background layer is not really movable, it's just the background, and that's all I've got in this photo. So I'm going to duplicate this layer so we have a copy of it, and then if I have the Move tool selected and I click and hold down, I can move that layer around. Just going to move it right back into place there. Save that for later maybe. Next is the selection tools. This is the rectangular marquee tool, and it's an M, and we'll get back to more about those keyboard shortcuts in a minute, but you can use this to select anything that is a rectangle. Now there are other selection options. If I click and hold down here, I can see them. The elliptical, which is a circle, single row, which is a single row, and then the single column. So it's basically horizontal and vertical selection tools, which this can be useful if you're selecting just a single row or column. Now if I want to cycle through these, I can hold down the Shift key and press M to cycle through them all. I generally like to stay on the rectangular marquee because it tends to be the most useful. And so if I have another layer and I wanted to just delete something, a section from it like this, it's gone. I just hit Command Z there on the Mac, Control Z on the PC to undo that. Next we have the polygonal lasso tool, and this also comes with other lasso tools. There's the regular lasso tool, which is probably what you start with, which is you can just do whatever you want and select like that. I prefer the polygonal lasso tool because it gives you more control, because you can just click points and it makes the shape, which seems kind of, edgy at the moment. I mean, it's very rough, but you can, if you're, careful and slow, click around and get a pretty good selection. Now, before we move on from this tool, we are going to take a look at some of the options up here. You'll see that when I switch tools, things change. Now, this has an option of a feather. If I were to select this like this and hit delete, you'll see it's just a very rough edge there. Now I can use feather, bring this up a bit, if I want to have a softer edge in my selection. See how it just kind of went like that? Now when I hit delete, you can see that it's kind of blended in. So that's, the feather just makes it a softer edge instead of having just a very, very hard, rigid one. So that can be good in some circumstances. You'll have these kinds of options with all of your tools, and you can just enter information here. If I want it to be 40 pixels, I just type in 40. If I want it to be 0, I can type in 0. And if I want to alter it, I can just click and hold down over feather and slide from left to right. So those are some options there. Next we have the magic wand and other selection tools, the quick selection tool. This basically will try to find like items and select them. Next we have the crop tool, which you can use to crop a photograph. it'll just let you do it freeform like that, and then you get this nice overlay, and then when you hit enter, it will crop. Alternatively, you can set the exact height and width to constrain it, or you can click front image if you want it to be the same size as the current image, which is 1024 by 683 at the moment. So if I were to select this and crop, what it would do is it would crop, but then also resize it to be the same resolution. Now you're still going to lose some sort of clarity in the image because you're resizing up and it has to resample the pixels, so it's not like it's going to be perfect. But if you want to remain at that size, that's what you can do. The eyedropper tool, which is up next, will select a certain color. Now you may not be noticing it when I'm clicking, but there's a color right over here that's changing. We're going to skip down here because this is the foreground color and the background color. If you click this thing up here, that'll set it to a foreground of black and a background of white. Now if you click the foreground color, you'll bring up the color picker tool, and then you can go ahead and choose whatever color you like. And you can also do this for the background. And if you decide you want to switch it, you can click that to switch it, or hit the X key to switch them back and forth. Also, to select this immediately, you press D, and that will get you back to black and white. Moving on, this is the healing brush tool, and you have quite a few options here. We're just going to look at the healing brush, not some of these others. Now the healing brush is a way to remove things. Now we're going to take a look at a kind of a gross photo, so if you don't like poop, it's a little dog poop. We don't want this dog poop in the photo, and the healing brush is something that can get rid of it. So I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger. Now this is something you can bring up by right-clicking on any brush, or most tools in general. If you just right-click, it'll bring up this nice little panel. We'll have it cover up that poop there. So to get rid of this dog poop, which is kind of gross, see, it's telling me because I just clicked without setting a source point, I need to click to define the source point. Now we want to just cover this up with more road, presumably. So I'm going to set the source point to somewhere around here where we have a large area around it to resample. I'm going to hold down Option to set the source point and click on it. Now I'm just going to paint over the poop like that. And it's gone. And that's basically what the healing brush does. Alternatively, you can use the clone stamp to do the same thing. Rather than actually healing it, it just clones it over. So if you don't want it to do any extra work, you just do like that. It's the same thing. You hit Option to set the source point, and then click, and then you just paint over it. But you can see it's just resampling from the rest of the image. Sometimes that's better. Sometimes just reusing a portion of the image that already exists is better than having the healing brush blended in, because the healing brush will take in more information than you need. So you might want to use that instead. Why they're not next to each other, I'm not sure. But going back up one, we have the paintbrush. And the paintbrush has a few options. You can replace colors, there's a mixer, there's the pencil tool, which is, it operates slightly differently than the brush. But we're not going to get into the differences. You can see I have a huge brush here. I'm just painting over the dog's butt. And then you can right-click to set the sizes, and you can also set lots of different brush sizes. We've talked about, changing things up here. You can see you can select the brush up here. You have those same settings up here. That goes for all the other tools, really. You can set a mode where, so if I wanted to color burn this in, that's not a good example because it's black, but let's say I had red. See how it's not painting directly red on? If I had it, if I had that blending mode set to regular red, it would paint like that. But instead, it's blending in with the photo using color burn, and that is an option. We'll talk more about blending modes in a little bit. So let's get rid of this photo because it's disgusting. Going back to this photo, since we're talking about burning, we're going to move down to here. Oh, nope, here. This is the burn tool, and it looks like someone making an O. And you have three tools here. There's the burn tool, the dodge tool, which is probably the one that's actually selected first, and the sponge tool. And what the dodge tool does is it brightens things up. The burn tool darkens them, and the sponge tool saturates and desaturates color. We're going to start actually with the dodge tool. So if I wanted to brighten this area up, this is going to brighten up the midtones of this tree. It's not doing a whole lot. If I try it over here, Still not doing a whole lot. And you can adjust how much it actually is capable of doing by upping the exposure in this top panel. And I'm also going to increase my brush size. Make sure we've got one of these brushes selected, actually. And see how I'm lightening up this forest here now. Okay, so that's the mid-tones. You can also brighten up the highlights, and you can also brighten up the shadows, which will have much more effect on the trees. None of this looks very good. So I'm going to use this history panel right over here to go back in time before we made all these horrible decisions. There we go, that's better. If I wanted to make something darker, I'd use the burn tool. So let's say I think that the space behind these trees is a little too bright. I'm darkening it up. You can't see that too much, so for demonstration purposes, we're going to bring that up to 100% there. There we go. That's nice and dark. Noxiously dark. Maybe. Maybe not. So there, I've darkened up the forest a bit. Lastly, if there's too much color in that forest, we can use the sponge tool to desaturate it. I'll make this bigger for demonstration purposes. Right now I have this set at 50%. You can see the color being drained out of this picture. If I change my mind and want to bring that color back, I can just saturate. Or if I want to really make it colorful, I can saturate it even more. Wow, that's bright. Great. Okay, so moving on, we've covered this, and then this is the history brush. What the history brush is something that takes things that you've done in the past and paints them back in. So if I wanted to go back in time a little bit to what we did here, you can see it's brightening this back up because that's what it used to look like. And so that's what the history brush does. The eraser tool, guess what this does? It erases stuff. It works just like the paintbrush, only it's an eraser. This tool is interesting. This is the paint can, but behind it is the gradient tool, and we're going to take a quick look at what both of these can do. Now the paint can is just going to fill in a color, but that's not really going to be terribly helpful for you with a photo. So we're going to make a new layer, and I'm just going to color this in red, and I'm going to choose a blending mode of color. Now we have a red photo. More useful is probably the gradient tool, in which you can apply gradients to your photos. Now we might not want that as a full-blown effect, but subtly that might bring in some nice color, just at 27%. Might not, depends on how you feel about it. But you can use gradients and the color fill tool to put together some basic photo filters. Moving on, we have the smudge tool over here, and if you're new to Photoshop, it's probably going to be set as the blur tool. And then there's the sharpen tool. This blur stuff, this sharpen stuff, smudging looks like this. Now, you can create some really neat effects with this, and it's really good for drawing also if you want to create kind of a blended color as you're putting together your illustrations. For photo editing, it can also be useful to have neat effects, like if you want to make wisps of clouds and so on, or just things kind of like fading into the ether. It can be useful for more than you would expect. So there you go. We're not going to get into that too much right now. Anyway, that's all for your major photo editing tools. We get into shape, text, and the path selection tool and the rectangular tool here. Pen tool here is basically if you wanted to draw something. This is not, you know, a really good example of a heart right now. But you can create vector shapes and transform them. I'm hitting Command T to transform. And that can be drawn. And then if you do transform and make it bigger, it doesn't matter because it's vector, so it's not going to get pixelated or anything and look stupid. Other than it already kind of looks stupid because it's a terrible heart. So we have this vector illustration here. The type tool is also similarly transformable in that you won't lose resolution. You can type whatever you want on the picture, and you can select all with Command A or Control A, and then use this slider up here to make the text bigger. And then there you go, you've got hello and a heart. Alternatively, if you're using the text tool, and you have the path selected by clicking it over here in the layers panel, you can see how it gets a little thing on it, how the type tool changes when you move over. And if you got that, then you can start typing on the path of the heart as well. So that's type on a path. There are other things that you can do with type, but those are the basic ones. The path selection tool lets you select paths that you create in your illustrations. The shape tool, well, this is set currently to rounded rectangle, but you can choose rectangle, rounded rectangle tool, ellipse, polygon, line, and custom shape. So these all make shapes like you would expect. This makes a rectangle. Pretty exciting. Custom shape tool gives you a whole bunch of custom shapes. So if you had a screenshot and wanted to point to something, you could use this arrow, and then you can transform it, Command T, and just move it around with your mouse and clicking around to get what you want. We're making this photo look really great, aren't we? So we've got that. Now the next stuff, we're going to just skip these because these are both 3D tools and we're not dealing with 3D. I have a personal opposition to 3D in general as far as, film goes. And I don't really understand it in Photoshop. It has its places, but we're not going to go there. The hand tool. This lets you move things around. This is for rotating. Now you might think, why do we have this tool if we have the hand tool? Well, we're zoomed in here. We're going to get to that one in a minute. You can use the hand tool to just move around in the window. You can actually throw stuff to it. It's got momentum now. So I guess that brings us to the zoom tool, which you can zoom in and zoom out. So if you zoom in, which is the default, click, 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 zooming in, you can see down here how much you're zoomed in. In fact, you can actually set it to whatever you want, but we're going to actually let's do it at 600, because if I hold down the Option key, it turns into zoom out, and there we are, zooming out of the photo. Okay, let's get rid of all of this. So now we've gone over the toolbar, and that's pretty much going to take you through most of what Photoshop can do. The other thing that you really need to know, however, is what's going on this side, and then we'll take a look at the menus really quick. Now, here, let's bring that heart back up. This is another layer, and this is the Layers panel, and this is where you're going to be for the most part. Here, you can select all different kinds of blending modes, which is how each layer affects the layers beneath it. So if I want to multiply, that will say only use the dark parts and make everything else see-through. So black wouldn't be see-through, but anything lighter than black will have some transparency. So you can see it has kind of a red, colorful effect there. Screen is the opposite, which only uses the light parts. And color dodge is dodging with that color. Color burn, where did that go? Oh, it's up here. Color burn is burning with that color. So you can go through these and see all of the different blending modes: overlay, soft light, hard light, just coloring it in, just using that color to color in the area, which is kind of a similar thing to the multiplying screen, but not necessarily choosing a light or a dark. Saturation will say how saturated is this color, and then make the rest of the photo as saturated as that color. Hue will change it to that hue. Luminosity is just, it's using its luminosity. So you can play around with these and see what they do. Also, if you double click in the blank area of the shape, you get into layer styles, and you can add effects: drop shadow, inner shadow, outer glow. Gradient overlay, you can set a blending mode for the gradient overlay. When you click on each of these things, you get a setting. So if we want the gradient to actually be an overlay, we can do that. Then let's multiply. All right. Very, very exciting stuff we've got here. So that's, the basics of what's going on in the Layers tool, other than you can adjust the opacity and the fill. So that looks kind of neat. You have other panels in here. There are the adjustments, these are your adjustment layers you can add. Clicking these will let you add photo adjustment layers on top of the current layer. So if I were to click this one for curves, it would add a curves layer. If we go over here, you'll see there's the curves layer. So I can make adjustments, and we'll go into how to make adjustments properly later. And then you can see I can turn those adjustments on or off, and they will not affect the heart if I were to move this layer below, this adjustment layer below the heart. It would only have effects on what's beneath it. But what's beneath it is mainly what's going on there, so it's kind of having an effect on the heart to some extent. Here you can edit your masks, your channels, red, green, and blue. and the paths that you create. So we're not going to go into a whole lot of this right now because it's still just getting to know what's going on. But that's essentially what you're working with here. You can also control new layers. You can flatten your image, which makes everything one layer. You go to layer properties, blah, blah, blah. Here are your layer options. Up here, we're going to take a look at the history panel. We've already seen this. You can go back in time to a certain extent, or to the beginning, or to back where you were. This is the type and paragraph tools. And this is the mini bridge, which works with the Adobe Bridge software. Not getting into that. This lets, up here you have your color swatch panel. You can edit and create colors. In here you can see that when I do it here, it's affecting the foreground color. Back over here, you can pick from existing swatches, and you can edit your styles. And styles are things like these layer effects, all combined together, and then you can just apply them. They're just basically presets. So that's what's going on this side of the screen, the right side of the screen. Up here you have your menus. You can save stuff, you can edit your images. Here in the image panel you can change between different color modes, change the size of your image, the canvas size, which means that it will change the actual canvas without resizing the image up or down. You can rotate and you can do all sorts of stuff. Layer menu is very similar to what you saw over here, only you have a few more options. This is where you can create adjustment layers as well. I'll create a new fill layer, kind of what we did over here before with the gradient. And the select layer will let you select things. And then you can also refine the edges, which is an option that will show up in this area when you are, when you actually have something selected. Filters, these are fun. Filters will let you do all sorts of things with your photo. Now we're not going to take a look at all of these because there are a lot, as you can see. Look at all of that. Okay, so main things that you might want to do is blur your image or add some noise, or probably actually the most interesting for a lot of people will be sharpening. But there are a lot of effects you can add and a lot of fun things you can do. We're not going to get into that right now, but that's what's going on. Analysis. There, I measured something. We're not really going to get into this a whole lot right now because this is not terribly useful for us right now. But when you're actually trying to figure out measurements in your photo and figuring out what to do, in terms of transformations and so on, you will need measurements to do them more effectively. So this is what this is for. 3D, we already talked about skipping that. View, this will let you just adjust your view, and you can also turn off sometimes annoying things like snapping. And snapping is when you're moving things around and they just kind of snap into place. Sometimes that's good because you want them to, and you can't, and it makes it easier for you to get things very precisely. But sometimes you want to be more precise than the snapping, and the snapping will suddenly you start moving things around, and then it will just snap to the other side like that. But you want to be over here, but it just keeps snapping, so you can turn that off. You can show and hide guides, which are things that if you have rulers on the, oops, hit the wrong button there. If you have rulers, you can drag them in here. Those are your guides. You can show and hide guides in the view menu. And then lastly, we have the window, which it lets you hide and display all the fun things that you're seeing all around you. And you can also save and create workspaces. And when you need help, because Photoshop's a big program and you need lots of guidance in using it when you're first getting started, you can find all your help here. So that is basically what everything in Photoshop does very, very quickly. Maybe not as quickly as I would have hoped, but that's an overview of what all the little tools do. So hopefully you have a better idea of how things work, and in our next lesson we will actually be looking at using some of these things in practical places.